My mother sold me on a Tuesday morning in November, while the first snow of the season fell soft and indifferent outside the kitchen window, and the coffee on the stove had not yet had time to go cold. She did not look at me when she said it. That is the detail I keep returning to even now. Not the man sitting across from her at the table. Not the envelope between them, cream-colored and plain, the kind you buy at any general store for a penny. Not the particular quality of the silence that had settled into that kitchen like wood smoke, low and permanent and impossible to clear. What I remember most is that my mother looked out the window. She had a way of doing that, turning toward whatever was outside when what was inside became too much for her. I had watched her do it my whole life. When my father died and the neighbors came with their casseroles and their careful faces, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. When the creditors came, the following spring, she stood at that same window and looked at the road. It was how Nora Vane handled the moments that asked too much of her. She turned toward the glass and let the world outside take the weight she could not carry herself. I was 20 years old. I had lived in that house every single day of those 20 years. I knew every sound it made in the night, every draft that came through the gap under the back door, every mood of that kitchen in every season. I knew my mother the way you know a place you have never been allowed to leave. And I knew, watching her hands as she set down her pen, that she was aware of what she was doing. Her hands shook. That is the other thing I remember, small and specific and impossible to misread. The pen had been steady enough when she signed, but when she set it down on the table and reached for her coffee cup, her hands shook. She knew. And she did it anyway. The man across from her was named Silas Pruitt. I had seen him twice before in my life, both times in passing, both times on the main street of Harwick, where he kept a small operation buying and selling various things that other people no longer wanted or could no longer afford to keep. He was not a large man, not a frightening one. He had the unremarkable face of someone who had made a career out of being easy to forget, and he sat in our kitchen that morning with his hat on his knee and his shoulders arranged in a posture that was meant to suggest he was here on ordinary business. He did not look at me either when I walked in. I had come down for breakfast the way I came down every morning. I was 5 months along by then, and the stairs had started to require more attention than they once had. I held the railing. I moved carefully. I had learned in the past months to move through the world with a particular kind of deliberateness, to take up exactly as much space as was necessary, and no more. I had been practicing taking up less space my whole life. The pregnancy had simply given me new reasons to continue. When I came into the kitchen and saw the envelope on the table, I did not understand immediately. I registered the man. I registered my mother's posture, which was the particular posture she assumed when she had already made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up to it. I registered the pen beside the envelope, and the pen was not the everyday pen my mother used for her letters and her household accounts. It was the good pen, the one she brought out for things that needed to be official. I stood in the doorway for a moment. My mother did not look up. Then I walked to the stove and poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, because I did not know what else to do, and sometimes the body just continues with its ordinary business while the mind is still trying to understand what the eyes are telling it. Pruitt cleared his throat. My mother said without turning from the window, "Rosa, this is Mr. Pruitt. You'll be going with him today." I set my cup down. "Going where?" She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice had the flat, settled quality of someone who has rehearsed the words enough times that they have lost whatever weight they once carried. "Up the mountain. There's a man there who needs help with his house. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." I looked at the envelope. "How much?" I said. The kitchen went very quiet. Pruitt shifted in his chair. My mother's shoulders moved in a way that was not quite a flinch. "Rosa," she said. "How much, Mother?" She did not answer. She lifted her coffee cup and turned a little further toward the window, as if by reducing the angle of her profile, she could reduce the reality of the conversation. And in that silence, in the absence of a number, I understood everything I needed to understand. I had spent 20 years trying to be useful, trying to be quiet, trying to take up the right amount of space, make the right amount of noise, want the right amount of things. I had cooked and cleaned and managed the household accounts after my father died, and I had done it without complaint, without praise, without much acknowledgement that it needed doing at all. I had in the past 5 months tried to minimize myself in every way a person can be minimized. I wore my dresses loose. I kept to the back rooms when neighbors came by. I did not speak of what had happened because my mother had made it clear that what had happened was a problem to be solved quietly, not a situation to be discussed. I had thought I was trying hard enough. I had thought that if I was useful enough, quiet enough, small enough, there would be a place for me in this house, even now. The envelope on the table told me I had been wrong. "All right," I said. I pushed back my chair. I went upstairs. I packed a canvas bag with 2 dresses, a hairbrush, the small Bible I carried more out of habit than faith, and a thin volume of poetry I had borrowed from the schoolteacher 2 years ago and never returned because Miss Aldrich had left Harwick the following spring and I had not known where to send it. I did not know why I packed the poetry. I packed it the way you pack the things that remind you that you are a person when everything around you is suggesting that you might be something else. I came back downstairs. Pruitt was standing in the entryway. He had put on his hat. He held the door open with the careful courtesy of a man who has been asked to do something he knows is wrong and has decided that good manners will serve as sufficient distance between himself and the wrongness of it. My mother was still at the kitchen table. She did not come to the doorway. She did not stand up. She sat with her coffee cup and her window and the particular stillness of someone who has committed to a course of action and knows that looking at the consequences of it will only make it harder to continue. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. The room smelled like coffee and cold ash from the stove that had not been properly cleaned in weeks. Outside the window, the snow was still falling, soft and slow, and without any particular urgency. "I'd like to know the number," I said. "At some point, when you're ready to say it out loud." My mother did not answer. I walked out the door. Pruitt's wagon was a serviceable thing, not comfortable with a wool blanket folded on the seat that he offered me without comment before he climbed up himself. I took it. The cold had already found the gaps in my coat. I spread the blanket across my lap and settled it over my midsection, and I felt the baby shift in response to the movement, a slow turning that had become familiar over the past weeks, like a sleeper adjusting position in the night. "It's about 4 hours," Pruitt said. "Up the mountain road, past the tree line, then another mile or so." "All right," I said. He adjusted the reins. The horse moved forward. Harwick began to fall away behind us. First the houses, then the church, then the general store where Jack Denny's family had run their business for 30 years. The building where Jack himself had stood behind the counter and smiled at me with that particular smile he had, the one that I had spent 18 months believing meant something permanent. I did not look at it as we passed. I looked at the road ahead, and then at the mountains, and then at the road again. The San Juan Range stood up against the November sky in the way it always did, massive and indifferent, the peaks already buried under the early snow. The pines pressed close on both sides of the road as we climbed, dark and still dropping small collapses of white when the wind moved through them. Pruitt tried conversation twice. First about the weather, which was undeniable and therefore safe. Then about the road conditions, which were passable for now, but would not be for much longer if the snow kept up. I answered in a way that was technically responsive without encouraging him to continue, because I did not have the energy for the performance of ordinary conversation, and I did not see why I should perform it for Pruitt's comfort. He subsided after that, and we climbed in silence. I kept my hand on my stomach. I had spent 5 months thinking of the pregnancy as a problem. As the problem, the thing that had set all the other problems in motion. Jack's disappearance, my mother's shame, the looks at church, the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the particular quality of sympathy that is more about the comfort of the sympathizer than the state of the person being sympathized with. Sitting in that wagon watching Harwick disappear below us and the mountains grow taller and closer and more real, I thought about the baby for the first time as something other than a problem. There was a person in there, growing in the particular dark of my body, unaware that the world outside was already complicated, already arranged itself around her in ways that would require navigating. A person who had no knowledge of envelopes or kitchen tables or mothers who looked out windows at the critical moment. A person who only knew that she was carried. I put my hand on my stomach and looked at the mountains and thought, whatever this is, you and I are going together. It was not hope exactly. It was something harder and more practical than hope. It was the decision to continue. The cabin appeared at dusk. We came through a break in the trees into a clearing, and there it was at the far end of it, low and solid, built against the rock face behind it, the way something builds itself when it wants to stay. Smoke came from the chimney in a straight gray line. A lean-to to one side held a mule and what looked like 2 months' worth of cured hides. There were no other structures, no other lights, nothing in any direction except trees and rock, and the gathering dark of a November evening at altitude. The snow was deeper here. It came up over my boot tops when I climbed down from the wagon, and my feet went cold immediately. I stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin and did not let myself feel whatever was trying to come up in my chest. I had become practiced at this over the past months. The feelings would keep. Later, when I knew what I was dealing with, I could feel them properly. For now, I needed to see. Pruitt knocked. He stepped back from the door with the posture of a man who is not entirely sure of his reception and has arranged himself accordingly. He glanced at me. The glance had something apologetic in it, though not enough to be useful. 30 seconds passed. Then the door opened. Callum Holt was taller than the doorframe required him to be. He had to angle himself slightly to fill it without ducking, and even so, his shoulders were close to the posts on both sides. He was lean in the way that men get when they work hard in cold country, and eat simply with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a beard that had not been tended recently, but was not unkempt. His hands resting at his sides were the hands of someone who used them constantly scarred across the knuckles thick through the palm, the kind of hands that knew what they were for. His eyes were gray, light gray, almost silver, in the last of the day's light. They moved over me with the same unhurried assessment I would learn that he gave to everything: a set of tracks in fresh snow, a change in the weather, coming in from the west, a problem that needed solving before it became larger. Not cold, not warm, simply observant. He looked at my face. Then he looked at my midsection. Then he looked at my face again. He did not say anything about what he had seen. He simply stepped back from the door, angling his body to make room. "Come in," he said. "The ground's wet. Not good when—" He paused, looked at the clearing, then at Pruitt, then at some middle distance. "Come in." He left the sentence unfinished. I would think about that unfinished sentence later in the particular way you turn a small thing over and over, because it contains more than its size suggests. He had been going to say, "Not good when you're carrying. Not good for the baby. Not good in your condition." He had started to say it and then stopped because he did not know how I felt about being referred to that way, and he did not want to get it wrong. So he left it open, and he stepped aside. I walked past him into the cabin. It was one room, clean in the way that things are clean when cleanliness is not a performance, but a practical matter when you live alone, and the organization of your space is the only order you have control over. A table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed along the far wall made with military precision, a single wool blanket folded at the foot. A wood stove in the corner with something simmering on top of it that smelled of venison and root vegetables. Pelts stacked along one wall in neat sorted rows. A lamp on the table lit, casting steady yellow light. And above the fireplace, on a simple wooden shelf, books. More than I expected. More than seemed to belong in a place this far from anywhere. I stood in the middle of the room and looked at the books while Callum Holt closed the door behind me. I heard Pruitt's wagon moving, already. The sound of it fading into the trees before the door had finished settling into its frame. He had not waited to see me inside safely. He had done his part, and he was going home. Behind me, Callum moved to the stove. I heard the sound of a ladle, the soft knock of a bowl against the wooden table. "Sit," he said. I sat. He set a bowl of stew in front of me, dark and rich steam rising from it. Beside the bowl, a piece of dark bread, a spoon. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down across from me, and opened a leather-bound ledger on the table beside his cup. He began writing in it. He did not speak. He did not watch me eat. He simply sat across from me in the lamplight, writing in his ledger, with the focused attention of someone who has a great deal of work to do, and does not intend to let the unusual nature of the evening interfere with his accounting of it. I looked at the bowl. I was hungry. I had not eaten since the evening before, because the morning had happened in the way it happened, and somewhere between the envelope and the wagon and the 4 hours up the mountain, I had forgotten that my body continued to require things regardless of circumstances. I ate. The stew was better than I expected, well seasoned with something herbal in it that I could not name. The bread was dense and good. I ate most of it before I set down my spoon and looked at him. He was still writing. The pen moved steadily across the page. Whatever he was tallying, it required concentration, and he was giving it that. "What exactly do you think you've gotten from Pruitt?" I said. He finished the line he was writing, set the pen down with care, looked up at me with those gray eyes, calm and direct. "Pruitt owed me money from an old transaction," he said. "He didn't have the money. He settled it in a way that was his decision, not mine. That's between him and whatever he answers to. And what does that make me, right now?" He looked at the bowl in front of me. "You're eating stew." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He picked up his pen. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." It was not the answer I wanted, but there was something in the plainness of it, the absence of any performance, no promises, no reassurances, no attempt to make the situation seem like something other than what it was that kept me from pressing further. I had expected something to defend myself against. I did not know quite what to do with a man who handed me a bowl of stew and went back to his ledger. I sat with that for a while. Then I ate the rest of the bread. He laid out a bedroll near the fire that night. Good wool, thick. He placed it near enough to the stove that the warmth would reach it, and he did this without being asked and without ceremony, the way he seemed to do most things because it needed doing, and he was the one available to do it. I lay awake a long time. The wind moved through the pines outside with a sound like breathing. The cabin walls settled in the cold with low periodic pops. Across the room in the narrow bed, Callum Holt's breathing was slow and even, and already deep, the breathing of someone with an untroubled conscience, or at least a well-developed relationship with sleep regardless of circumstance. I stared at the ceiling and thought about my mother's hands, the way they shook when she set down the pen. She had known. I kept coming back to that. Not that she had done it, but that she had known in the moment of doing it that she was doing something she could not undo. And the knowing had made her hands shake, and she had done it anyway. I had spent 20 years trying to be enough for that house, trying to be useful enough, quiet enough, small enough. And in the end, it had not been about me at all. It had been about the baby and the shame of the baby, and the fact that my mother did not have the resources, financial or emotional, to face what was coming. She had looked at me and seen a problem she could pay someone else to take. Lying on the floor of a stranger's cabin with the fire at my back and the mountains outside pressing close on all sides, I made myself a promise in the dark. I was done trying to earn my place in rooms that would never want me, whatever this mountain was. Whatever this silent man with his ledger and his stew and his shelf full of books turned out to be. I would not beg. I would not shrink. I would not let anyone in this world make me feel again like something that could be handed off with a cup of coffee going cold on a kitchen table. But even as I made that promise, I was aware of something else. Something quieter underneath it. Callum Holt had looked at me, not past me, not through me, not at the inconvenience of me, or the problem of me, or the cost of me. He had looked at my face, and then at my stomach, and then at my face again, and he had stepped back from the door and said, "Come in," and left the sentence unfinished so he would not get it wrong. I did not know what to do with that yet, so I let it sit there beside the promise, and I closed my eyes, and eventually the sound of the wind and the fire and the man breathing steadily across the room pulled me under into something that was not quite peace, but was for the first time in a long time quiet. There is a particular kind of silence that has weight to it, that settles on you like a hand pressed between your shoulder blades, constant and inescapable. The silence in my mother's house had been like that. You felt it in every room, in every meal eaten without conversation, in every evening, where the only sounds were the clock on the mantel and the wind and the awareness that there were things being carefully not said. The silence in Callum Holt's cabin was different. It took me 3 days to understand the difference. On the first day, I was too tired and too raw to analyze anything. On the second day, I was still finding my bearings, learning the rhythms of the space where things were kept. How the stove behaved in the early morning when the overnight cold had settled into it. On the third day, I sat down with my coffee and looked at the man across the table and tried to put a name to what was different about the quiet between us. He was not talking because something was wrong. He was not managing me with silence, using the absence of speech to communicate displeasure or distance, or the particular kind of punishment that people deploy when they want you to know you have failed without telling you how. He was quiet, because quiet was simply how he moved through the world. He did not talk to fill the air. He did not explain himself. He moved through the cabin and through the clearing and through the dark forests beyond it with the same unhurried certainty, and the silence around him was not heavy. It was just his. Once I understood that, I stopped waiting for it to mean something bad. I started watching instead. He rose before light every morning without exception. By the time I opened my eyes, he had already fed the stove, put coffee on, and gone out to check the traps he had set the previous day. He came back with his cold still on his coat, stamped the snow from his boots at the door, with 2 sharp strikes of each foot, and sat down with his coffee and whatever the morning had given him to think about. He did not ask me how I had slept. He did not make conversation for the sake of it. But every morning there was a second cup of coffee on the edge of the stove, placed where the heat would keep it warm. Not commented upon, not presented. Just there. I noticed that on the second morning. I did not say anything about it, but I noticed. By the third day, I had taken over the cooking. This was not generosity. Let me be clear about that. It was strategy, and a fairly desperate one. I needed something to do with my hands, or I was going to lose my mind staring at the walls of that one-room cabin, and cooking was the one competency I had that required no explanation and no permission. I had been cooking since I was 9 years old. I knew how to do it without thinking, and not thinking was exactly what I needed for portions of each day. I made biscuits that first morning, nothing elaborate. Flour, fat, a little salt, the sourdough starter I found in a crock near the back of the shelf. I set them on the table without comment and waited. Callum came in from the cold, looked at the biscuits, sat down, ate 3 of them before he spoke. "These are good," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me, a quick look, sharp and brief. Something moved behind his eyes that might in another man have been the beginning of a smile. Then he picked up his coffee cup and opened his ledger, and that was the end of it. It was the closest thing to a conversation we had managed in 3 days, and I found to a degree that irritated me that it had made me feel marginally better. On the 4th morning, something happened that I have thought about many times since. Callum was standing near the stove, and I was reaching up to the shelf above it for the salt, and he was there suddenly, in the space behind me, not touching me, not crowding me, simply moving through the room on his way to something else. My body reacted before my mind did. I stepped sideways. Small, automatic, the practiced movement of someone who has learned to clear space when another person enters it. He stopped. I kept my arm raised, hand on the shelf, did not look at him. I heard him move, not toward me, around, to the other side of the stove where he picked up whatever he had come for, and then he was gone from that part of the room, and the moment was over. I stood there for a second with my hand on the salt and understood in a way I had not expected to understand anything that week what had just happened. I had flinched, not from fear exactly, from habit, from 20 years and a pregnancy's worth of making myself smaller whenever someone else needed to occupy space. And he had gone around, not over me, not through me, not past me with the small friction of proximity that says, "You are in my way." He had simply gone around as if my being there was not an inconvenience, but a fixed fact of the landscape, like a stone or a tree, something the terrain includes rather than something it accommodates. I did not say anything about it, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. He did not ask about the baby's father. I want to be specific about this because it matters. Everyone in Harwick had either asked or had communicated through elaborate and highly effective indirection that they were aware of the question and had formed opinions about it. My mother's friends asked with their eyebrows. The women at church asked with their studied avoidance of certain topics. Old Dr. Halverson had asked directly and written down my answer in a ledger not unlike the one Callum kept, though I suspect Callum's was less judgmental. Everyone asked. Callum Holt did not ask. He did not ask on the first day or the third or the sixth. He did not ask with his eyes or his silences or the careful architecture of his conversation. He fed me and worked beside me and wrote in his ledger and went out to his traps and came back again, and the subject of what had brought me to this particular mountain at this particular time was never raised. I was not sure at first whether this was courtesy or indifference. As the days passed, I came to understand that it was neither. It was something else, something that took me longer to name because I had not encountered it before. He did not ask because he considered it none of his business, not because he did not care, but because some things belong to the person who carries them, and a person has the right to put those things down in their own time and their own way, and pressing them to do it sooner is not kindness. It is convenience dressed up as concern. I was 20 years old, and I had not known before that week that a person could operate that way. On the 5th day, I asked him directly, "What exactly do you think you own from the arrangement with Pruitt?" He was skinning a rabbit at the table, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and no longer has to think about the individual steps. He did not pause. "I don't think I own anything," he said. "Then what am I doing here?" "You're here because Pruitt made a decision and left you at my door." He set down his knife, looked at me steadily. "I didn't agree to that arrangement. I agreed to a debt being repaid in money. What Pruitt did instead is on Pruitt. So you're going to send me back. Where would I send you?" I did not answer that. "That's what I thought," he said. He picked up his knife. "You can stay as long as you need to stay. I'm not asking for anything in return. The cooking is useful but not required. If you want to leave, I'll take you down to Greer's Mill myself, and you can find your own way from there. And if I stay, then you stay." He turned the rabbit. "And we don't make it more complicated than that." I sat with that for a long moment. "You're a strange man," I said. "I've been told." He went back to his work. I went back to mine. On the 7th day, Amos Webb came up from Greer's Mill with the monthly supplies. He was a small, weathered man in his 70s, with the careful movements of someone who has survived a great many winters by paying close attention and not assuming anything. He pulled up in a wagon that was only slightly larger than Pruitt's and unloaded flour and salt and oil and 3 tins of something I could not identify from the window. I was inside. I had been rearranging the supply shelf, not snooping, simply taking inventory the way I had always taken inventory at home, because knowing what you have is the only way to plan for what you need. I heard their voices outside, low and indistinct, and I was not particularly listening. Then I heard my name. "Mrs. Vane sent word," Amos was saying. "Says the girl is likely to be delicate, prone to illness. If there's any trouble with her, she wants to know." There was a silence. When Callum spoke, his voice had not changed in register or volume. It was the same quiet level voice he used for everything. But there was something in it that had not been there before, a quality like the stillness before weather. "Mrs. Vane received payment," he said. "Whatever rights she thinks she has to Rosa ended there. If she sends word again, tell her I don't receive it." A short pause. "All right," Amos said. Then after another moment, so quiet, I almost missed it. "Add ginger root to next month's order. Fresh if you can get it. Good for a woman in her condition in the cold months." I stood absolutely still behind the supply shelf. I had my hand on a tin of salt that I had been about to move. I did not move it. I stood there with my hand on the cold metal, and the words settling around me, and I did not fully understand at first why they were making it difficult to breathe properly. It was not the first part. The part about my mother and her rights and the payment she had received. That was accurate and clear and carried with it a kind of legal finality that I appreciated. It was the second part. Ginger root. He had remembered. I had mentioned it once in passing on the second day when I had been explaining to myself rather than to him why the morning cold was harder to manage than usual, that ginger helped with the nausea that still came sometimes despite being 5 months along. I had not been asking for anything. I had simply been noting a fact the way you note the weather. He had heard it, filed it, and now, a week later, was quietly adding it to a supply order because the cold months were coming and it would be useful, and that was simply what you did when someone in your household needed a thing. My mother had not remembered my due date until I reminded her. Jack Denny, in the 18 months I had known him, in the months we had been together, in the 3 months I had known I was pregnant and had tried to talk to him about it, had not once asked how I was sleeping, or whether the mornings were difficult, or what I thought the baby might need. This man, this stranger with his ledger and his gray eyes and his absolute refusal to make conversation for its own sake, had heard a passing comment 7 days ago and was ordering ginger root. I stood behind the supply shelf in Callum Holt's cabin, and I did something I had not done since the morning in my mother's kitchen. I cried, not noisily, not dramatically, just the quiet, involuntary kind, the kind that comes when something bypasses the defenses you have spent months carefully constructing and reaches the thing underneath them that is still tender. Not because I was sad, because I was surprised. Because I had not known going into that mountain that being remembered in small ways could feel like more than being promised great things. I had received promises. Jack Denny had been very good at promises. My mother had promised in her way for 20 years that she would do better, be different, turn back from the window at the crucial moment. None of those promises had meant what ginger root meant. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, composed myself, moved the tin of salt. When Amos Webb's wagon had gone and Callum came back inside, I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of dried beans and giving no indication that anything particular had happened. He hung up his coat, sat down, opened his ledger. "Amos will have the order ready in 4 weeks," he said. "All right," I said. We did not discuss what had been said outside. We did not need to. The conversation had already happened in the space between the shelf and the stove privately, without witnesses, and it had changed something in the architecture of the room that I would not have been able to articulate and did not try to. I stirred the beans. Outside, the November snow was coming down in earnest now, steady and settling, covering the clearing and the trees and the mountain in the particular white silence of a season that intends to stay. I thought about the months ahead. The snow and the cold and the long dark that would come before spring. The cabin that was one room and therefore could not be anything other than shared. The man who wrote in his ledger and went out to his traps and left a second cup of coffee on the stove every morning without mentioning it. The shelf of books above the fireplace that I had not yet let myself approach. The baby growing in the particular dark of my body, unaware that the mountain existed, unaware that the world outside was complicated and cold, and arranged itself in ways that would require navigating. Unaware of anything except that she was carried. I had been carried to this mountain by circumstances I had not chosen. I had arrived with a canvas bag and a borrowed book of poetry, and the specific numbness of someone who has been through enough in a short enough time that the feelings have had to go somewhere else temporarily in order for the practical business of survival to continue. But standing at that stove, in that one-room cabin on that November evening when the snow was coming in properly and the fire was burning well and the beans were beginning to smell like something worth eating, I became aware of something that was not numbness and not quite hope, but was somewhere in the direction of it. I was still here, and the man across the room had ordered ginger root, and neither of us had made it more complicated than it needed to be. That would have to be enough for today. And today, I found unexpectedly, was enough. The storm came on a Sunday. I know it was a Sunday because Callum had mentioned the day before that he intended to go down to Greer's mill the following morning, and when I woke to find the world outside the cabin windows replaced entirely by white, I understood from the particular set of his shoulders as he stood at the glass with his coffee and looked out at what the night had done that the trip was not happening. Not today. Perhaps not for several days. He turned from the window without comment. Sat down. Opened his ledger. I made biscuits. This had become, in the 3 weeks since my arrival, something close to a ritual. Not because biscuits were required, but because the act of making them was one of the few things that organized the morning in a way that felt deliberate rather than simply sequential. Flour, fat, salt, the careful working of the dough that required attention without demanding thought. By the time the biscuits were in the pan and the pan was on the stove, I had usually found my footing for the day. That first morning of the storm, I made the biscuits and we ate them, and the snow kept coming, and neither of us remarked upon it. By midday, the clearing had disappeared. The tree line was a suggestion at the edge of visibility. The lean-to, where the mule sheltered, was completely buried to its eaves, and Callum, without being asked and without announcing his intention, put on his coat and went out with an armload of straw to pack around the animal's stall. He came back coated in white, stamped his boots, hung his coat, and sat back down. I watched him do this and thought he went without being asked. It seemed a small thing. It was not a small thing. I had grown up in a house where everything that needed doing had to be either assigned or negotiated or justified. My father had not been a cruel man, but he had been one who required the work of a household to be made visible to him before he acknowledged it existed. And after he died, the negotiating had continued because my mother managed the world through a system of requests and obligations and the careful accounting of who owed what to whom. Nothing in that house happened because someone simply noticed it needed doing and did it. Here a mule was cold in a storm, and Callum Holt went out with straw. I filed that away with the ginger root and the second cup of coffee, and added it to the careful inventory I had been keeping without quite knowing I was keeping it. On the second day of the storm, I reorganized the supply shelves. This was genuinely practical. I had been meaning to do it since the first week when I realized the shelves had been arranged by someone, Callum, presumably according to a logic that prioritized accessibility for his own workflow, rather than any systematic accounting of what was there and what was running low. I could work with his system, or I could build one that made better sense, and I chose to build a better one because I was going to be here for a while, and I preferred to be able to find things. I worked through the morning moving tins and sacks, and the various small containers of dried herbs and spices that Callum kept in quantities suggesting he took his cooking more seriously than his beard implied. I worked methodically shelf by shelf, making a mental list of what was adequate, what was low, what was missing entirely. It was on the third shelf behind a row of tinned goods that I had moved to count them that the box shifted. It was a small wooden box, the kind that might have held correspondence or a few pieces of jewelry or any number of things a person wanted to keep separate from the general disorder of daily life. It had been sitting slightly at an angle, the lid not quite seated properly, and when the tins shifted, it tipped forward and fell open against the shelf edge. I caught it before it dropped. Inside was a photograph. A woman. Young, perhaps my age, perhaps a few years older. Dark-haired, sitting very straight in the careful way that people sit when they are aware of being photographed and want the record to show them at their best. She was pretty in a serious way, with a face that suggested she thought carefully before she spoke, and probably expected the same of others. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one, as if the photographer had said something just before the shutter that had almost made her laugh. I turned it over. On the back in handwriting that was not Callum's 4 words, always yours, and then a single initial, E. I stood there for a moment. The storm moved against the walls of the cabin with a low, steady pressure, and the fire crackled in the stove, and Callum was somewhere outside checking on the mule again, and I was holding a photograph of a woman who had written always yours on the back of her own image and given it to a man who had kept it for what looked like a very long time. I put it back exactly as I had found it, repositioned the tins, continued with my inventory. But I thought about it for the rest of the day. I thought about it while I made supper, and while we ate it across from each other in the lamplight, and while he wrote in his ledger and I sat with the thin volume of poetry I had taken from the shelf on the second day, the one he had said nothing about when I took it, and nothing about in the 3 weeks since. I thought about who E was and why the box was kept, but not locked, and what had happened to the woman with the serious face and the almost smile that she was not here now in this cabin, and he was. I thought about what it meant that a man who kept everything else in his life stripped down to function and necessity had kept one photograph for what looked like years. He was not a man who kept things he did not mean to keep. On the third evening of the storm, I read a line aloud. I did not intend to. I had been reading for an hour slowly the way I always read poetry, which is to say, with the awareness that the words are doing more than one thing at once and deserve the time to do all of it. The fire was good. The cabin was warm against the storm. Callum was reading across from me a thick history of the Western Territories that he had apparently been working through for some time, judging by the battered state of its spine. The line I read aloud was this. She learned to hold herself like an apology, always sorry for the space she took. I read it quietly, almost to myself. The way you speak a thing when you need to hear it in your own voice to understand what it means. Callum stopped turning pages. The silence that followed was different from the silence that usually lived in the cabin. That silence was full and comfortable, the silence of two people occupied with their own thinking in the same warm room. This silence had a quality of attention in it, of someone listening. Read it again, he said. I looked up. His book was closed now, his thumb between the pages to hold his place, and he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the calm, assessing neutrality he wore for most things. Something quieter than that. Something that had not been carefully arranged. The line, he said. Read it again. I read it again. My voice was steadier the second time than the first, which surprised me. He sat for a moment after I finished. Then he nodded very slightly as if the line had confirmed something he had been considering for a while. He opened his book again and turned back to his page. He did not read another word that evening. I watched him not reading and understood without either of us having to say so that the line had meant something to him that had nothing to do with me. That somewhere inside the careful quiet of this man was something that recognized itself in those words. Something that had also learned to hold itself like an apology. I did not ask about it. I turned back to my own page. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls and found no way in. It was on the fourth day, the last day of the storm, that he told me about Clearwater. We had been sitting on opposite sides of the fireplace for most of the evening. I had finished the poetry and started on a slim history of the Colorado Territory that had been on the shelf, and he had returned to his territories book, and the storm was loud against the walls in a way that made the cabin feel smaller and closer than usual, which was not entirely unpleasant. He closed his book, set it on his knee, looked at the fire. I was a deputy marshal, he said. Before this. I looked up. In a town called Clearwater, south of here by about 40 miles. He was still looking at the fire, not at me. The way people look at things that are not present when they are talking about things that are not present. I was good at it. That was the problem, maybe. When you're good at something, people stop thinking of you as a person who does that thing. They start thinking of you as the thing itself. I waited. I had learned by now that with Callum waiting was usually the right thing. There was a man I worked with, he said. A senior marshal. Respected. People in Clearwater trusted him the way people trust the men who carry the law in a place that doesn't have much else to hold things together. He paused. I found out he was taking money. From men who needed things overlooked. Not small things. He turned the book over in his hands. Back and forth. A slow, almost unconscious movement. I didn't act immediately. I waited because I wanted to be certain. Because I knew what it would mean to make an accusation against a man in his position without enough to stand behind it. And I had learned that lesson earlier in my life, and I was not going to make that mistake again. I gathered what I could. I built what I thought was a case that would hold. He stopped. In the time it took me to do that, he said, a man died. A rancher from outside of town who had seen something he was not meant to see and had made the mistake of saying so to the wrong person. He died, and it was the kind of death that looks like misfortune if you are not looking carefully, and most people in Clearwater were not looking carefully because they trusted the man I knew was responsible. The fire settled, a log shifted, and sent a brief shower of sparks up the flue. I reported it. I had enough by then to make the report hold. The senior marshal was removed. There was an inquiry. He set the book down. But the rancher was still dead, and I had known for 6 weeks what kind of man was wearing that badge, and I had waited for the evidence to be airtight, and in those 6 weeks a man had died who might not have died if I had acted sooner. You couldn't have known the timing, I said. No. His voice was even. But I knew the danger. I made a calculation, and someone else paid for it. I looked at him. He was still watching the fire, his face not quite pain and not quite peace, but somewhere in the difficult country between them, the place where a person lives when they have walked through something hard and come out the other side still upright but permanently marked. And your wife, I said. He looked at me then, the first time he had looked directly at me during this whole conversation. Eliza, he said. Her name was Eliza. He said it the way you say a name that you have not said aloud in a long time, with the careful pronunciation of someone who does not want to get it wrong. The inquiry was public. In a town that size, everything is public. She was a private person. She did not want to be the wife of the man at the center of it, on either side of it. I understood that. I did not blame her for it. He looked back at the fire. She left in the spring. I came up here in the fall. To punish yourself, I said. He was quiet for a moment. To stop being in a position to make decisions that cost other people things, he said. I looked at my hands, at the firelight moving across them. Those two things are not as different as you think they are, I said. He looked at me again, the same look. Something unguarded in it, the way a window is unguarded when it is briefly open. No, he said after a moment. I suppose they're not. We sat in the firelight and did not say anything else for a long time, and the storm pushed against the walls, and the fire burned down slowly, and outside, the world was white and pressing and indifferent, and inside, it was warm. I thought about what he had said, about decisions and costs, and the arithmetic of consequence, about the way a person can do the right thing and still have it come out wrong, and what you do with yourself after that. I thought about Jack Denny, who had not done the right thing, who had looked at the arithmetic of his own situation and calculated that I was on the wrong side of the ledger and acted accordingly. I thought about my mother, who had looked at the same arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusion. I thought about Callum Holt, who had done the right thing too late and was living up here in the snow with his traps and his ledger and his shelf of books, paying a debt to himself that no one else had asked him to pay. There was something in that comparison that I would need to think about more carefully later. It doesn't work, I said finally. Disappearing. It just moves the hurt somewhere you can't see it. He looked at the fire. How old are you? He said. 20. You talk like someone older? I grew up fast, I said. Or I had to, which I suppose is the same thing. He nodded slowly, picked up his book, did not open it, sat holding it and looking at the fire. And we stayed like that until the storm blew itself out sometime before morning. And when I woke, the world outside was clean and white and absolutely still, and Callum was already gone to his traps, and the second cup of coffee was on the edge of the stove. Beside it, placed there with care, was the history of the Western Territories he had been reading. A thin strip of leather marked his page. He had left it there deliberately in the spot where the coffee went, so that it would be the first thing I saw. I stood in the quiet of the cabin and looked at that book for a long time. A man who left books did not leave them by accident. January came to the San Juan Mountains the way January always comes to high country, without apology and without any suggestion that it intended to be brief. The cold was a different order of magnitude from the November cold that had greeted my arrival. It had weight to it, a density, the kind of cold that did not simply surround you, but pressed into you, looking for the gaps. I had gaps. My coat was built for Colorado winters at lower elevation, for the cold of a town where you moved between heated buildings and heated wagons and your own heated house, where the cold was a thing you passed through, rather than a thing you inhabited. Up here on this mountain, the cold was where you lived. And my body, which was doing the significant additional work of growing another person, was not always keeping up. Callum noticed this. He did not say he noticed. He simply one morning, in the second week of January, produced from the back of the lean-to a heavy wool coat that was considerably larger than anything I owned. He set it on the table without comment and went back to his ledger. I looked at the coat. "That's not yours," I said. "It was my wife's. She left it here when she came to help me move up from Clearwater, before she decided she was not staying." He did not look up. "She was taller than you, but close enough in the shoulders. The length will be long, but it's better than what you have for this weather." I sat with that for a moment. There was something here that required careful navigation. The coat had belonged to Eliza. It had presumably been hanging in the lean-to for 7 years since the spring she had left Clearwater, and this man had come up the mountain. He had not gotten rid of it. He had also not offered it to anyone before now. I picked up the coat. It was good wool, dense and tightly woven, the kind of garment made to last rather than to impress. It smelled of cedar and something faintly herbal, and very faintly of thyme. It was warm. I put it on. The sleeves came past my wrists by 2 inches. The hem hit me at mid-shin rather than at the knee where it had presumably hit Eliza. But the shoulders were close, as he had said, and the front closed over my midsection with room enough for the baby, and the warmth of it was immediate and significant. I stood in the middle of the cabin wearing a dead relationship's coat and thought, this is a strange life. Then I thought, but it is a life. And that in January was worth something. The baby moved more in January. Or perhaps I simply had more time to notice it with the trapping season slowed by the deep cold and the cabin hours growing longer. She had her rhythms by now, her active periods and her quiet ones, the particular kind of movement that meant she was stretching versus the kind that meant she was simply shifting. I had learned them the way you learn the rhythms of a place you live in, not all at once, but gradually, through sustained attention. One evening in the 3rd week of January, I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of salt pork and dried beans, and she kicked. Hard. Harder than usual, a sudden sharp assertion of presence that made me stop stirring and catch my breath. Callum was sitting behind me at the table. I do not know precisely why I did what I did next. I have thought about it many times, and I cannot locate a decision in it. It did not feel like a decision. It felt like the natural extension of a moment, the way one note follows another, in a sequence that makes sense only after you hear it whole. I turned around. I took 2 steps to the table. I reached out and took Callum's hand, which was resting on the open page of his ledger, and I placed it against my stomach where the baby had kicked. He went very still. We stayed like that, my hand over his pressing lightly, the fire at my back, the lamp on the table between us casting its steady yellow circle. She kicked again. Twice quick, emphatic, as if she had been waiting for an audience. Callum did not move, did not pull away, did not say anything. I looked at his face. I had been studying his face for 2 months by then, learning its vocabulary, the small and subtle language of a man who communicated primarily through action and stillness rather than words. I had learned what he looked like when he was concentrating on his ledger, which was different from when he was reading for pleasure, which was different again from when he was watching the tree line for weather. I had learned the way the skin around his eyes changed when something struck him as almost funny, the slight shift in the set of his jaw that preceded the rare occasions when he was going to say something that mattered. I did not have a word yet for what I saw on his face in that moment. I would not find the word for it until much later, and when I did, it surprised me with its simplicity. He looked like someone arriving somewhere they had not expected to reach. "She does that," I said, because the silence had filled up with something that needed a small, ordinary thing to balance it. "When she decides she wants to be noticed." He looked down at our hands, at the place where the movement had been. "Yes," he said quietly. "I see that." I took my hand back and turned to the stove. He sat at the table for a long time without writing anything. The letter from my mother arrived in the 1st week of February, delivered by Amos Webb on his monthly supply run. It was written in the same hand she had used for all my life for the household accounts and the letters to her sister in Denver, neat, precise, economical with space. My mother did not waste pen strokes. She wrote as she did most things with the minimum required, and not one thing more. She asked about the weather. She mentioned that the winter had been difficult in Harwick. She noted that the Hendersons had sold their farm and moved east, which she offered, without commentary, though I knew from the way she placed it in the middle of the letter between weather and health that she intended it as information about the general instability of things. Then, near the end, written with the same even hand as everything else, Jack Denny was married last Saturday. A small ceremony at the church. The Harrow girl. I thought you should know. And then I hope you are keeping well. The baby will come soon. I read the letter twice, folded it, set it on the table. Callum was across from me. He had seen the letter arrive, seen me read it. He had not asked what it contained. He would not ask, but he had also not found some errand to attend to some reason to be elsewhere while I processed whatever the letter held. He was simply there at the table with his coffee present in the way he was always present when something required witnessing. I looked at the folded letter. Jack Denny married someone else last week, I said. Callum said nothing. The Harrow girl. I don't know her well. I looked at my coffee cup. I don't know why my mother thought I needed to know that. I think she thought she was being kind, giving me information. She always believed that information was more useful than comfort. A pause. She was usually right about that, I said. I just don't know whether she's right about it this time. Callum looked at me across the table, steady and unhurried. How do you feel? He said. It was the first time he had asked me that, in 2 months. The first direct question about my interior state. I considered it carefully because it deserved consideration and because he had asked it in a way that suggested he wanted the actual answer. I feel like something that was already loose finally came free, I said. Not painless, but cleaner than before. He nodded, slowly, as if that made sense to him. He's gone, I said. He was already gone, but now he's gone in a way that's on paper somewhere, and that makes it final. And final is easier to work with than maybe. Yes? Callum said. It is. He said it in the particular way that told me he was speaking from his own experience of something, not offering a general observation. I did not ask him to expand on it. I understood that some things you say in recognition rather than explanation. I put the letter in the stove that evening, watched it burn. Then I made supper, and we ate it, and the February dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere below us, Harwick continued its winter business, and Jack Denny was married to a woman I barely knew. And I was here on this mountain 5 months and 3 months and 1 month and 1 week and 1 day removed from the morning my mother had turned toward the window. And I found feeding the fire, with the last of the letter's ash, that the distance felt right. In the 3rd week of February, Callum told me about Amos. Not Amos Webb, the supply man. The other Amos. The rancher from Clearwater who had died. He told me in pieces over several evenings the way difficult things sometimes have to be told, not all at once, because all at once would be too much weight in one place, but gradually, layer by layer, until the whole shape of it was visible. The rancher's name had been Amos Sutter. He had a wife and 2 sons and 160 acres of grazing land south of Clearwater. He had seen the senior marshal accept money from a man whose cattle operation was, to put it plainly, not entirely composed of cattle that belonged to him. He had seen it and mentioned it quietly to a neighbor who had mentioned it less quietly to someone else, and the news had reached the senior marshal before it reached Callum. By the time Callum had enough evidence to act, Amos Sutter had died in what was recorded as a riding accident. His horse had thrown him on a clear day on familiar ground. These things happened in ranch country. Everyone said so. Everyone meant it, except Callum, who could not prove otherwise and whose inability to prove it had become one of the central facts of his life. I knew when I started gathering evidence that I was in a race, he said on the 3rd evening. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself that presenting a case that could be dismissed would be worse than presenting no case at all. He looked at the fire. I was being careful. I was also being afraid. Those 2 things can look identical from the inside. What were you afraid of? Being wrong, being dismissed, making an accusation against a man with 30 years of service and having it come back as my word against his. He was quiet for a moment. I had been dismissed before. Earlier in my career, a different town, a different situation. I had learned that lesson, and I was not going to learn it again. So you waited? So I waited. He looked at his hands. And Amos Sutter went out on a clear day on a horse he had ridden for 8 years, and he did not come back. I sat with that. You couldn't have known the timing, I said again. The same thing I had said on the night of the storm. But this time, I was not offering it as consolation. I was offering it as a fact that needed to exist alongside the other facts. No, he said. But I could have acted sooner, and I will spend the rest of my life not knowing whether sooner would have been enough. That's a heavy thing to carry, I said. Yes. And coming up here doesn't put it down. It just means you're carrying it alone. He looked at me with those gray eyes that had spent years learning to give nothing away. This time, they gave something. I know, he said. I looked at him. This man who had known the right thing and chosen the careful thing and lost the person it cost anyway. This man who had come to a mountain to pay a debt in solitude that no one else had asked him to pay. This man who left books by the coffee and ordered ginger root and went out with straw before anyone had to ask. Carrying it with someone doesn't make it lighter, I said, but it means the weight is spread over a wider base. Things don't tip over as easily. He looked at me for a long time after that. The fire burned. The February night pressed against the windows. My daughter, who did not yet have a name, moved in the warm dark of my body, and I put my hand on my stomach, and Callum watched me do it. You were going to tell me something else, he said, about carrying. I thought about it. I was going to say that I carried myself like an apology for 20 years, I said. And I'm not sure I even knew I was doing it. I thought I was being considerate, being appropriate for the space I occupied. I didn't understand that there's a difference between consideration and erasure. What changed? I looked at the bookshelf above the fireplace, at the poetry volume slim and slightly battered that I had read 3 times through by now. I'm still figuring that out, I said. But I think it starts with someone not looking away. The fire settled. We sat in its light, the two of us carrying our respective histories in the warm room, and outside the February cold continued its patient work, and neither of us said anything more that night, and nothing needed to be said. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, when the sky had cleared for the first time in a week, and the sun was coming off the snow with a brightness that was almost violent after the gray of the long storm, Callum came in from the traps with a rabbit and 2 partridges and set them on the table and looked at me. There's something I want to say, he said. I waited. I am not good at this, he said. He meant speaking about the things that mattered. He meant the interior work, the putting of important things into words that could cross the space between 2 people and arrive intact. He was not making an excuse. He was offering a fact. I know, I said. I have not said the thing that I think should be said. I have been waiting for the right moment, which is what I always do, and I have decided that waiting for the right moment is what I do instead of doing the thing. He looked at the rabbit, then at me. So I am going to do the thing. I did not move. You are not here because of Pruitt, he said. You are not here because of a debt or an arrangement or any of the circumstances that brought you up the mountain in November. He stopped, looked at the window, then back at me. You are here because I am glad you are here. And I wanted to say that plainly without waiting for the right moment, because I have learned that there is no right moment. There is only the moment you have and whether you use it. And I wanted to say that plainly without waiting for the right moment, because I have learned that there is no right moment. There is only the moment you have and whether you use it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the snow on the clearing sent back the morning light in long, bright sheets. That, I said after a moment, is the most words I have heard you say at one time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. Something that had been near a smile for a while and was getting closer. I know, he said. I may need to rest. I looked at this man, this large, quiet, careful man who had carried his guilt up a mountain and lived with it alone for 7 years, and had just said, I am glad you are here, with the gravity of someone who does not say things they do not mean. I'm glad I'm here too, I said. It was the first time I had said it. The first time it had been true in a way I could say aloud. He nodded once, picked up the rabbit, went back to work. I turned back to the stove. Outside, the sun continued to come off the snow with that almost violent brightness, and somewhere below the clearing, I could hear for the first time since November the faint sound of the creek moving beneath its ice. Not free yet, not open, but moving. Finding its way through in the particular stubborn way that water has toward whatever was waiting on the other side of winter. I put my hand on my stomach and listened. The creek moved, the fire burned, and inside the warm room on the mountain that was beginning slowly and in stages to feel like something other than a destination I had not chosen. 2 people went quietly about the work of continuing, and the February light came through the windows and found everything it touched and held it. March came to the San Juan Mountains the way spring always comes to high country, not as an arrival, but as a negotiation. The snow did not leave. It simply began in certain hours of certain days to consider the possibility of leaving. The southern face of the clearing would show dark earth by mid-afternoon, only to be covered again by morning. The creek below the cabin, which I had been listening to since February, grew louder in its movement beneath the ice. A low and persistent murmur that Callum told me meant the melt had started higher up in the places where the sun reached first. I had learned to read the mountain by then. Not the way Callum read it, which was the reading of someone who had lived inside it for 7 years and knew its moods the way you know the moods of a person you have spent a long time paying attention to. But I had learned enough. I knew which direction the weather came from and what the sky looked like 2 hours before it arrived. I knew the sound the pines made when the wind was moving through them with intent versus the sound they made when the wind was simply passing. I knew that the mule grew restless before storms and settled in the cold, clear nights. And I knew that Callum, on the mornings when the creek was loudest, stood in the doorway with his coffee for longer than usual, turning his head slightly toward the sound, the way a person turns toward a voice they recognize. I did not mention that I had noticed this. I had learned living with Callum Holt that there were things he felt deeply that he would never, in his life, announce, and that the most honest version of him existed in the small, unguarded moments he did not realize he was sharing. The doorway and the creek were one of those moments. I let him have it. My body in March had become a different country from the one I had inhabited in November. I was 8 months along. The baby had run out of room for the dramatic assertions of presence she had favored in January, and had shifted to a constant low-level occupation of every available inch, a kind of territorial settlement that made certain positions untenable and certain movements require advanced planning. Sleeping required an architecture of blankets and angles that I had worked out through trial and error over several weeks. Rising from chairs required a specific sequence. Putting on boots had become a project. Callum had begun without comment or apparent decision to be available at these moments. Not intrusively, not in a way that suggested he thought I could not manage. But he was there. When I rose from the chair by the fire, he was nearby. When I came down the 2 steps from the door in the morning, he had already cleared them of ice. When I needed something from the high shelf, it had usually been moved to a lower one sometime in the preceding days. He did this the way he did everything that mattered, without announcement, without expectation of acknowledgement, simply because it needed doing, and he was the one available to do it. I thought sometimes about Jack Denny. Jack had been present in all the ways that are visible. He had been attentive in public, solicitous in the ways that people can observe and report. He had opened doors and pulled out chairs and said the right things when the right things were called for. He had done all of this with a fluency that I had once mistaken for character. What Jack had not done was move things to lower shelves. What Jack had not done was notice in advance and quietly, without making it a moment of generosity, requiring gratitude what was needed before it was needed. The difference between those two kinds of presence I had come to understand was the difference between performance and attention. One was for the audience. The other was for you. On a Thursday morning in the second week of March, I was in the clearing splitting kindling. This had become one of my tasks. Not because anyone had assigned it, but because I had found in the later months that certain physical activities organized my body in ways that were more comfortable than stillness. The motion of the axe, the satisfying crack of the wood, the pile growing beside the lean-to, these things had a completeness to them that I appreciated. I was reaching for another piece of wood when I heard it, the sound of a wagon on the trail below. I straightened, stood, listened. Callum came around from the lean-to before the wagon had cleared the tree line. He had heard it too. He stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands at his sides and waited. The wagon came through the trees. Silas Pruitt. He looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. In November, he had seemed a considerable presence, a man with authority over my immediate future, a representative of the forces that had determined my circumstances. Now he was simply a small man in a winter coat, on a wagon seat, looking at us with the careful expression of someone who is not entirely sure of his welcome and has arranged his features accordingly. He pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down with the careful movements of a man taking pains to signal that he poses no threat. His hat came off. He held it in both hands. He looked at me. Something crossed his face that I would have called relief, except that relief implied he had been worried about my welfare, and I was not entirely ready to extend him that credit. Then he looked at the rest of me, at the axe in my hand, at the pile of split kindling, at the coat, Eliza's coat, that had been with me through the whole winter, at my midsection, which was now impossible to misread. He looked away. "You're looking well," he said. To the general vicinity of the clearing, it seemed, rather than to me specifically. "I'm right here, Mr. Pruitt," I said. "You can say it to my face." He looked at me, had the decency to appear uncomfortable. "You're looking well," he said again, this time to my face. "Thank you." He turned to Callum, produced from inside his coat an envelope, cream-colored, plain, the kind you buy at any general store for a penny. I knew that envelope. "Mrs. Vane," Pruitt said. "She's had a change of circumstance. Wants the girl back." The clearing went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of the cabin in the evenings, the quiet of two people at ease in the same warm space. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes when something that has been at a distance is suddenly close, and the distance is revealed to have been a mercy you had not fully appreciated while you had it. I looked at the envelope. I thought about a kitchen table on a November morning, about cream-colored paper and a good pen, and the particular sound of a signature being made on something that cannot be unmade. I thought about a window and a cup of coffee and a pair of hands that shook. I thought about 4 months on this mountain, about biscuits and ginger root and a coat from a high shelf and a man who stood in the doorway listening to a creak and did not know anyone was watching. About a line of poetry read aloud and heard. About a baby who kicked and a large hand that did not pull away. I thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when Callum had set down the skinned rabbit and said, "I am glad you are here," with the gravity of someone delivering a fact they had been holding for a long time and had finally decided you were allowed to know. I set the axe down, carefully, leaned it against the woodpile. "No," I said. Pruitt blinked. The word had come out clean and uncomplicated, without the scaffolding of explanation or apology that I would have built around it 6 months ago, the qualification and the softening and the careful arrangement of phrasing designed to make the refusal easier for everyone except me to bear. Just no. The whole word with nothing taken off it. "I beg your pardon," Pruitt said. "No," I said again. "Whatever her change of circumstance is, it is not my problem to solve. She made her decision at a kitchen table in November. I have made mine on this mountain." I looked at him steadily. "Tell her I said no." Pruitt looked at Callum. Callum looked back at him, those gray eyes level and patient, giving nothing that was not asked for. "Holt," Pruitt said, "you've got nothing legal here. If the woman wants her daughter back, she sold her daughter. Callum's voice was quiet, the same voice he used for everything. But underneath the quiet was something that had been there since November, something I had been watching grow without knowing quite what to call it. Whatever claim she believes she retains, she surrendered when she accepted payment. Rosa has said no. That is the end of it. Pruitt stood in the clearing for a moment longer. He was looking at me. Not the way he had looked at me in November, when I had been a transaction in progress, a piece of business being transferred from one account to another. He was looking at me the way you look at something that has changed in the time you were not watching it, and you are trying to reconcile what you see with what you expected to find. I met his gaze and held it. Something happened in his face. Not a large thing. A small shift, barely visible, the kind of movement that is easy to miss if you are not in the habit of watching faces carefully. I had been in the habit of watching faces carefully for most of my life, because in the house I had grown up in, faces were where the real information lived underneath the words. What I saw in Pruitt's face in that small shift was recognition. He recognized what he had done. Not in the abstract, the way a person can know they have done something wrong while maintaining comfortable distance from the knowledge. He recognized it specifically in the particularity of this moment, looking at the person the wrongness had been done to. He put the envelope back in his coat. He put on his hat. He climbed back up onto the wagon with the same careful movements he had used getting down the movements of a man taking pains not to make anything worse by how he occupied space. Before he picked up the reins, he stopped. "I'm sorry, Miss Vane," he said. He said it to me directly, looking at my face. "I should not have been part of it. I knew that, and I did it anyway, and I am sorry." I looked at him for a moment. There are people who apologize because they want to feel better. The apology is for them, it closes the account, releases the weight, allows them to go home and sleep without the thing pressing on them. And then there are people who apologize because they understand that the closing of the account is not theirs to do, that the debt is real and will not be canceled by their saying so, and they say the words anyway because they are the only true thing available to offer. Pruitt's apology was the second kind. "I know," I said. "Thank you for saying it." He nodded, picked up the reins. He left without looking back. I watched the wagon until the trees took it, until the sound of it faded down the mountain and was replaced again by the ordinary sounds of the clearing wind in the pines, the distant creek, the settling of snow. Then I turned around. Callum was watching me. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "What you said to him, about the claim she surrendered." "I know," he said. "She's my mother. You didn't owe me that." "I didn't do it because I owed you." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said everything that he meant completely. I stood in the clearing with the March sun on my face and the smell of pine and cold water in the air, and looked at this man who had not done it because he owed me, and I found that I did not have words adequate to the moment. So, I did not use words. I simply stood there and let the moment be what it was. He went back around to the lean-to because there was work to be done, and Callum Holt had never known how to follow a significant moment with anything other than continuing to move through the world. I picked up the axe. I stood in the clearing for a long time after he had gone. That evening after supper, I wrote a letter to my mother. I sat at the table with the lamp and the pen and the paper, and I wrote it the way you write a letter when you have decided that honesty is more merciful than kindness, because kindness without honesty is only a deferral, and deferral had been the primary mode of my mother's house for as long as I could remember, and it had brought us here. I told her I was not coming back. I told her that I understood she had been afraid that I had known her long enough to recognize fear operating underneath the decisions she made, and that understanding this did not require me to excuse it. I told her that I hoped she found a way to live with what she had done that did not require her to revise what it was, because revision without acknowledgement was the kind of peace that crumbled. I told her the baby was healthy, that the mountain was cold, but the cabin was warm, that I was being looked after, which was a sentence I had never in my life been able to write to her before, and which cost me something to write now because I had wanted it to be from her that I wrote it. I told her she could write to me if she wanted to. I did not tell her the rest. There was a rest, a growing, complicated, alarming rest, that I was not yet ready to put into words even for myself, let alone for my mother. That could wait. I folded the letter, set it with the things Callum would take to Greer's Mill at the next opportunity. Then I sat with my hands on the table and the lamp burning and the fire in the stove and the baby moving in the low, settled way she moved in the evenings, and I thought about the word no. How long I had not had it. How long it had been folded away somewhere inside me, waiting for a moment when the cost of using it was one I could afford. I could afford it now. I did not know exactly when that had changed. I could not locate the specific morning or evening or quiet exchange in the lamplight when I had become a person with access to her own refusals. But I knew that it had happened here on this mountain, in this one-room cabin, with its shelf of books and its second cup of coffee, and its large, quiet man who moved things to lower shelves without announcement. I thought, this is what it feels like to be put back together. Not all at once, not dramatically. In the way that ground thaws in spring from the inside out, in the places where the warmth reaches first, then gradually outward, until one morning you press your hand to the earth and find it yielding rather than solid, and you understand that the work has been happening all along underneath where you could not see it. I put my hand on my stomach. She settled. We went to sleep. She came on a Monday morning in the first week of April, when the snow had pulled back from the clearing enough to show the dark earth along the south edge, and the creek below the cabin was running clear and fast for the first time since October. I had been awake since before dawn, not with the dramatic warning that I had read about in the pamphlet the circuit doctor had given me in Harwick the previous summer, not the sudden catastrophic signal that announces everything is beginning. It was more gradual than that, a tightening, recurring patient, a steady negotiation between my body and the baby that had been building through the night with the methodical accumulation of something that knows it will not be stopped and sees no reason to hurry. I lay in the early dark and listened to it and did not wake Callum immediately. This was not bravery. It was the particular hoarding of private time that I had come to value on this mountain the minutes before the day began, its demands when the world was still and the cabin was still, and I was still, and whatever was true was simply true without requiring action yet. But when the gray light began to come through the windows, and the tightening had shortened its intervals considerably, I said his name. He was awake before the sound had finished leaving my mouth. 7 years of living alone at altitude where the difference between sleeping and waking could be the difference between weathering a storm and being caught outside in one had given him the capacity to come fully alert from deep sleep in the space of a breath. He sat up, looked at me, looked at my face. "It's time," I said. He was out of bed and into his boots and coat before I had finished the sentence. He looked at me once more, assessing the situation, with the same calm attention he gave to everything, a stretch of unfamiliar trail, a weather change coming in from the west, a problem that needed solving before it became larger. "Mrs. Chapman," he said. Agnes Chapman was the nearest woman with midwifery experience 4 miles down the mountain in Greer's Mill. They had discussed this, he and I, weeks ago in the matter-of-fact way that they discussed practical necessities. He had known the route, known the time it would take in various conditions, known when to leave. "Yes," I said. "I'll be back before it's needed." He was out the door. I heard the mule being saddled in the lean-to. The sounds were quick and economical, no wasted motion, and then the sounds were moving away down the mountain trail, and then they were gone, and I was alone. I want to describe those hours carefully because they were not what I had feared they would be. I had been afraid, in the months of anticipation, that being alone in a one-room cabin on a mountain 8 months from the kitchen table in Harwick, and the life I had lived there, would feel like abandonment. Like the final confirmation of a pattern that when things became most difficult and most demanding, I would be left to manage them by myself. Because that was the arrangement the world had made with me. But it did not feel like that. I moved around the cabin in the intervals between contractions, doing the things that needed doing. I fed the stove. I put water on to heat. I folded the extra blankets and placed them near the bed. I moved with the same deliberateness I had developed over the past months. The deliberateness of someone who has learned to be precise in the use of her energy, because the energy is required for something important. I was not alone in the way I had been alone before. Before this mountain, alone had meant unseen. Alone had meant the absence of anyone who would notice what you needed before you asked for it, or remember what you had mentioned in passing, or stand in a doorway listening to a creak and feel something they did not announce. Alone had been a condition of invisibility. This was different. Callum was 4 miles down a mountain trail in the cold dark of an April morning, riding as fast as the trail allowed because I had said his name, and he had heard it, and he had gone. That was not abandonment. That was the opposite of abandonment. That was someone moving toward you at speed. I sat with a contraction and breathed through it and thought, I am not alone. Then I got up and checked the water. He came back as the sun was clearing the eastern ridgeline 4 hours after he had left. I heard the mule, and then heard voices, and then the door opened, and Callum was there with Agnes Chapman behind him, a compact woman in her 60s, with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had attended enough births to understand that the process has its own authority, and the best thing a person can do is stay out of its way and be useful. Callum's hair was frozen at the temples. His coat was soaked through where he had ridden into the wind. His boots left wet tracks across the floor. He looked at me. I looked at him. I wanted to say something that would carry the weight of those 4 hours. The trust of saying his name in the dark. The sound of him going. The cabin while he was gone, and how it had been full of his absence in a way that made me understand how much of its warmth came from his presence. I wanted to say all of that. What I said was, "You're frozen." "I'm fine," he said. Agnes Chapman was already moving hands and purpose, organizing the space with the efficiency of long practice. Callum went to the corner of the room with the particular quality of someone who knows that his job right now is to be present without being in the way, and that this is its own skill, and he is capable of it. He stayed there. Through all of it, through the hours that followed, and the work that my body did, and the sounds I made that I had not expected to make, and the moments when I thought I could not, and then did anyway, he stayed there. He did not look away. He did not find reasons to be outside. He stood in the corner of that one-room cabin and witnessed, in the way he witnessed everything that mattered, with the full attention of someone who understands that being present for a difficult thing is not a passive act. Clara came into the world at mid-morning. Agnes Chapman caught her, and the sound that followed was the sound I had been imagining for 9 months without being able to imagine it properly, because there is no sound quite like it. The first cry of a specific person announcing themselves to the world for the first time, and it was louder than I had expected, and more complete, and more absolutely itself. Agnes wrapped her, set her in my arms. I looked at my daughter. She was red and furious and perfect, with dark hair pressed flat against her head and eyes screwed shut against the novelty of light, and she was the most real thing I had ever held, more real than any circumstance or decision or loss that had brought me to the moment of holding her. I had spent 9 months thinking of her as a problem, and then a possibility, and then a person, and now she was here, and she was none of those things, and all of them. She was Clara, a specific, irreducible individual who had arrived with her own face and her own voice and her own claim on the world, and she was mine, and I was hers, and nothing that had happened in November or in the years before November could reach this moment. I looked up. Callum was still in the corner. He was looking at Clara. Not the way that people sometimes look at newborns, with the polite, uncertain attention of someone who is not sure what the appropriate response is. He was looking at her the way he looked at things that mattered to him, steadily, completely, with the full weight of his attention, as if he were committing her to memory. "Come here," I said. He crossed the room. He was careful, the way large men learn to be careful in the presence of small things. His movements reduced to their minimum, nothing wasted. He stopped at the edge of the bed and looked down at her, and his face did the thing it did at the doorway with the creak. The unguarded thing, the thing he did not know he was showing. Something in him had come fully still, the way a man goes still when he is holding something he does not want to drop. I shifted my arm slightly. He looked at me. I looked at him. He sat on the edge of the bed, very carefully, as if the whole enterprise were made of something that could be disrupted by a careless movement. And I placed my daughter in his arms, and he held her with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been given something of absolute value and is not going to be the reason anything goes wrong. Clara blinked, opened her eyes for a moment, unfocused, taking in the light and the general fact of the world, then closed them again. Agnes Chapman was moving quietly around the cabin, tidying with the discretion of someone who understands that the real event is not her business. The fire crackled. The creek ran outside clear and fast and sure of itself. Callum looked at Clara. Clara was unaware of being looked at, occupied entirely with the business of being new and the significant work of breathing. I watched them. I thought about the morning in November when I had come down the stairs and seen the envelope on the table and understood that I was going to be handed off at a kitchen table, like something that had outlived its usefulness. I thought about the wagon and the mountain and the dark and the snow and the cabin at the edge of the clearing with its smoke going straight up in a windless sky. I thought about ginger root, about a coat from a high shelf and a line of poetry heard twice, about a man who went around rather than through, about a sentence left unfinished so it would not get it wrong, about 4 hours on a mountain trail before dawn in the cold so that I would not be alone. I thought this is what it looks like when someone decides you are worth the effort of the cold and the dark and the distance. Not with words, with a saddled mule and frozen hair and wet boots leaving tracks across the floor. Agnes left after 2 hours with the assurance that everything was as it should be and that she would come back up the following week to check. She refused Callum's offer of payment with the brisk efficiency of someone who knows what the correct thing is and does not need to discuss it. When she was gone, the cabin was very quiet. Callum had returned Clara to me and gone to sit in his chair by the fire. He was still in his wet coat. I had noticed this some time ago and had not mentioned it because there was a limit to what I could manage simultaneously, and the coat had not been the priority. "Your coat is still wet," I said. He looked down at it as if he had forgotten it was there, got up, hung it by the stove, sat back down. "Thank you," I said, "for this morning." He shook his head slightly, as if the morning had been a simple matter of logistics and gratitude was beside the point. "Callum?" He looked at me. "Thank you," I said again. "I want you to hear it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You said my name in the dark, and I went. That's all. That's not a small thing." "No," he said, "it's not." Clara was asleep in my arms. Her breathing was the particular breathing of the newly arrived, slightly irregular, working out the rhythm of a thing she had never done before. I watched her figure it out and thought she is solving a problem she did not know she would face, using tools she does not know she has yet, and she is doing it. That seemed to me like the best possible beginning. 3 weeks later, Callum took me down the mountain to Greer's Mill for the first time since November. It was a practical trip. Clara needed to be seen by the circuit doctor who came through Greer's Mill on a regular schedule. I needed to be seen by him as well. We needed supplies that the monthly order had not covered, specific things that a new baby required, that Callum had added to the list with the same quiet thoroughness with which he approached all practical matters. It was also, though neither of us said this, the first time I would be in a public place since before Clara was born. The first time I would be in a place where people who were not Callum or Agnes Chapman would look at me, at us, at the three of us, and whatever the three of us appeared to be. I dressed carefully that morning, not out of vanity, or not only. Out of the understanding that the way you present yourself to the world is a choice, and I intended to choose clearly. Amos Webb was standing at the door of his store when we pulled up. His face, when he saw Clara, arranged itself into something warm and entirely unguarded, the face of an old man who has seen enough of the world to know that the arrival of a new person in it is a simple and unreserved good. "There she is." he said softly, as if he had been waiting. Then he looked up past the baby, and something changed in his expression. "There's someone inside," he said. He was looking at me. "Came in this morning. Said she'd wait." I knew. I do not know how I knew. I had not been expecting it. There had been no further letter from my mother after the one I had written in March, which she had received, I knew, because Amos had confirmed the delivery. She had not responded. I had not pressed. But I knew. I looked at Callum. He looked at me. Those gray eyes, steady and without advice, leaving the decision entirely where it belonged. I climbed down from the wagon. My mother was sitting at the small table in the back corner of Amos's store, where he kept 2 chairs for customers who needed to rest during long trips. She was wearing her good winter coat, the dark green one she saved for occasions. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, with the careful stillness of someone who has been sitting for a while and has had time to decide what to do with their hands. She looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing. The same thing I had thought about Pruitt when he had come to the clearing. The people from the life before this mountain kept arriving smaller than I had left them. I did not know whether they had changed or whether I had simply grown to a size from which they appeared differently scaled. She looked at me, then at Clara wrapped against my chest in the carrier that Callum had fashioned from a length of wool cloth, following instructions I had found in one of the books on the shelf. Something moved across my mother's face. She stood up, slowly, with the movements of a woman who has rehearsed this moment many times and is now discovering that the rehearsal did not account for the reality of it. She looked at Clara's face. Clara was awake in the alert, considering state she occupied in the hours after feeding, looking at the world with the dark, unfocused gaze of someone taking inventory. My mother looked at her granddaughter for a long time. Then she looked at me, and for the first time in my memory, Nora Vane did not look away at the critical moment. She held my gaze. There was something in her face that I had not seen there before, or had not seen clearly, or had not been able to see through everything else that had always been in the way. It was not the fear, though the fear was there. It was not the pride, though, that was there too, smaller now, occupying less of the available space. What I saw underneath all of it was exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a hard winter or a difficult trip down from Harwick. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something too heavy for a long time and has finally, in this back corner of a general store in a small mountain town, run out of the energy required to keep carrying it as if it were not heavy. "She's beautiful," my mother said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Her name is Clara," I said. My mother nodded, looked at Clara again. Her hands at her sides were doing the thing they had done on the morning of the envelope. A small, involuntary trembling that she was not entirely in control of. "I came," she said, "because I wanted to see her." A pause. "And because I owe you something that I should have said before any of the rest of it happened." I waited. "I was afraid," she said. The words came out with the deliberateness of someone saying a thing they have not permitted themselves to say aloud. Not a reason, not a justification, just what it was. I was afraid of the money, and afraid of the neighbors, and afraid of what it meant that you were in the situation you were in, because it meant that I had not done what I should have done for you, and I could not face that. So I did the thing that solved the immediate problem and did not look at what it cost. She stopped. "I am sorry, Rosa," she said. "I am sorry for the kitchen table and the envelope and the man I brought into our house and the window I looked at instead of your face. I am sorry that I was not the kind of person who could stand up straight when it was difficult. I should have been. I knew it then, and I know it now." The store was quiet around us. Amos had retreated to the far end, occupying himself with the business of inventory, with the discretion of someone who understands that some conversations need the pretense of privacy even when true privacy is not available. I stood in the back corner of that store with my daughter against my chest, and my mother in front of me, and I looked at her. I had imagined this conversation many times over the winter. I had rehearsed various versions of it in the long evenings in the cabin, working through what I would say, what I needed her to understand, what acknowledgement I required before I could give her anything in return. I had built a careful architecture of conditions. Standing here in the reality of it, the architecture seemed less necessary than it had in the imagining. I could see my mother clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not the version I had carried in my head through 20 years of trying to be enough for her, the version that was primarily composed of her limitations and my responses to them. The actual woman, small in her good green coat, with her folded hands and her trembling and her exhaustion and her sorry. She had not been strong enough. That was the true and sufficient fact. She had not been strong enough, and she had done what people who are not strong enough do, the smaller, easier, more immediate thing, and lived with the cost of it. I knew something about that arithmetic. I had been making my own version of it for years, choosing the smaller thing, the quieter thing, the thing that would cause the least disturbance, the thing that required the least of everyone, including me. The difference between us was that I had been given a mountain. "I know you're sorry," I said. "I believe you," my mother exhaled. "I'm not coming back to Harwick," I said. "That's not a punishment. It's simply where I am now, where my life is." I looked at Clara, who was still regarding the world with her dark, considering gaze. "But I would like Clara to know her grandmother. If you're willing to make the trip on the occasions when the road allows it, you're welcome at the cabin." My mother looked at me. "I would like that," she said, barely above a whisper. "Then that's what we'll do." I let her hold Clara. I watched her hold Clara, this woman who had run out of the energy required to maintain the distance she had built, and I thought about what Callum had said on the night of the storm months ago. About the difference between exile and protection. About how a person can convince themselves that disappearing is an act of kindness toward the people they might otherwise damage. My mother had not disappeared. She had sold me, which was different, crueler in its directness. But the mechanism underneath it was the same, the belief that removing yourself or removing the problem was preferable to standing in the difficulty and trying to do the right thing in full sight of everyone. I had been doing my own version of removal my whole life, making myself smaller, taking up less, disappearing into usefulness. The mountain had given me back my size. I did not say any of this to my mother. It was not the moment for it, and some understandings are not transferable. They have to be arrived at individually along whatever path the individual is given. I could not hand her mine. I could only hold Clara and watch and be glad that my daughter would have a grandmother who had found her way to this back corner of this store on a spring morning in April, 200 miles from easy, because some things are worth the distance. Callum was waiting outside when we came out. He had been talking to Amos or listening to Amos talk, which was functionally the same thing. When I came through the door with Clara and my mother behind me, he looked at my face first, reading it the way he read the weather, the trail, the quality of light that told him things that other people would not have thought to look for. Whatever he read seemed to satisfy him. He looked at my mother. She looked at him. "Mrs. Vane," he said, not cold, not warm, acknowledging. "Mr. Holt," she said. A pause. "She's being looked after," he said. "Both of them." My mother looked at him for a long moment. At the size of him, the weathered steadiness, the gray eyes that gave only what was earned. At whatever she could read in him, which I suspected was not very much because Callum Holt was not easy to read, unless you had spent a winter learning the vocabulary. "I can see that," she said. She left after an hour. The trip back to Harwick was long, and she needed the daylight. She held Clara one more time before she went for a little longer than the first time, and she did not look away. We watched her wagon go down the valley road. Then we turned back toward the mountain. We were married in June. On a Thursday morning, when the clearing was full of the particular gold light of early summer, when the creek was running clear and fast over the rocks, and the smell of the pines was warm for the first time since autumn, and the sky above the San Juan peaks was the specific blue that you only see at altitude, bright and deep, and entirely itself. The minister from Greer's Mill came up on the road that had been clear for a month now. Amos Webb came with him because Amos had known Callum for 7 years, and had, I think, been waiting for something like this, with the patient optimism of someone who believes that people are capable of finding their way to the right place if given sufficient time. Clara slept in the carrier against my chest, through the whole of it, unaware that anything in particular was happening, occupied with the serious business of growing. The minister read what needed to be read. Callum said his vows looking directly at my face. Not away, not at the middle distance where he usually sent his gaze when things became important. At my face. At me. With the expression I had learned to recognize over the winter, the expression he wore when he was fully present, rather than managing his presence when he had decided that whatever the cost of being seen clearly was, it was one he was willing to pay. I said mine in the voice I had carried like armor for 20 years, and it was not armor. It was simply my voice. Mine. The voice of a woman who had said no in a clearing with an axe in her hand, who had read a line of poetry aloud and let it be heard, who had placed a hand over a large hand and pressed it to the place where her daughter moved. My own voice, saying my own words. We were married. Amos shook Callum's hand and kissed my cheek and looked at Clara with the same warm, unguarded face he had shown at the store door in April, the face of an old man who knows a good thing when it arrives. The minister had coffee and one of my biscuits, which he complimented with the specific enthusiasm of a man who does not eat well enough. And then they rode back down the mountain together, and Callum and I stood in the clearing in the June light with our daughter between us. He took my hand, not with ceremony, not with the self-consciousness of a moment being created for the memory of it. The way he did everything simply because it was the next true thing, and he intended to do it. I thought about November, about the wagon coming up the mountain trail in the snow, and the clearing appearing through the trees and the cabin at the far end of it with its smoke going straight up in a windless sky. About the door opening, and the man in it, and the sentence left unfinished, so it would not get it wrong. That evening, after Clara had been settled into the small crib that Callum had built in February from spare wood, he had been saving, shaped, and sanded, and fitted together with the same careful attention he brought to anything that needed to last. He sat down beside me at the table. He had something in his hand, a folded paper. He held it for a moment without opening it, as if deciding whether the time was right. He had learned over the winter to act when the moment was available rather than waiting for the perfect one. He opened it. It was a letter from a lawyer in Denver, dated February. I read it. He had written to the lawyer in February asking about the legal standing of an unmarried mother with regard to her child's custody, and specifically about the rights of a maternal grandmother in Colorado territory law in such a situation. The lawyer had written back with the relevant statutes. He had written back again with follow-up questions. The lawyer had answered those. The correspondence covered several months. It was careful and thorough, and entirely practical, the work of someone who had identified a potential problem and gathered all available information about it before the problem materialized. February. He had started this in February, 3 months before Pruitt had come to the clearing. 4 months before my mother had come to Greer's Mill. I looked at the dates, at the careful, thorough questions, at the work of a man who had seen a risk and gone about addressing it the only way available to him, which was information and preparation and the patient building of understanding. I looked up at him. February, I said. Amos had mentioned in passing that your mother had been asking questions in Harwick, about the law, about grandchildren. He looked at the paper. I wanted to understand what the law said before she had a chance to use it. You didn't tell me. You had enough to manage. I looked at him, at this man who had gone out in the dark before dawn to get a midwife who had moved things to lower shelves and ordered ginger root and stood in the corner of the room through all of it without being asked, who had written to a lawyer in February because someone had mentioned in passing that my mother was asking questions and he had thought I should know what the law says about this, and he had gone and found out. He had been protecting us, not loudly, not in a way that required recognition, in the only way he knew how, which was practical and thorough, and conducted in the spaces where no one was watching. When I came up the mountain, I said, in November, you were watching from the window, before Pruitt knocked. He looked at me steadily. I saw you on the wagon, he said, coming through the trees. You had your hand on your stomach, and you were looking up at the mountain, not at the cabin, at the mountain itself, as if you were deciding whether it deserved your attention. And I thought she is not what Pruitt said she was. I waited. He had written ahead, Said he was bringing a girl who needed a place, someone who would be grateful for the work. His voice was even. That is not what I saw on the wagon. I saw someone who was deciding, making a judgment about a situation she had not chosen. You opened the door, I said. Yes. Before you knew anything about me. I knew that, he said. I knew you were making a judgment rather than simply arriving. That was enough. I sat with that. Clara breathed in her crib across the room, the small, steady breath of someone perfectly occupied with the work of growing. The fire burned in the stove. Outside, the June dark had settled over the clearing and the creek and the pines and the mountain that had been silent for 7 years before a wagon came up the trail with a woman who was looking at the mountain rather than the cabin and deciding whether it deserved her attention. It's still possible, I said. He looked at me. Caring about someone, I said. You told me once you kept the photograph of Eliza so you wouldn't forget that it had been possible, that you had been capable of it. I looked at him. It didn't go anywhere. It was here the whole time. He was quiet. Yes, he said. Just that. One word with everything in it. I reached across the table and took his hand. He looked down at our hands. Then he looked up at me with those gray eyes that had spent 7 years learning to give nothing away, and had over the course of one winter and one spring and one summer morning, with a minister and a cup of coffee and a biscuit slowly and without announcement given everything. Outside, the creek ran clear. The pines stood tall and unhurried against the Colorado dark. The clearing was full of the particular silence of a summer night at altitude, the silence that is not empty, but full of the small sounds of a living world going about its business without requiring anything of you. Inside the cabin on the mountain that had once held only one person, and his grief of family was having its first evening together. Clara breathed. The fire burned, and I sat at the table in my own home, in my own life, in the space I had not shrunk to fit, but had simply over the course of a long winter grown into, and I thought, this is it. Not the life I had expected, not the life that had been arranged for me in Harwick, the narrow, apologetic life of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible and call it consideration. Not the life that a kitchen table and a cream-colored envelope and a pair of shaking hands had tried to determine for me. This life. This specific, improbable, difficult, warm, sufficient life. Mine. I looked at Callum, who was looking at our daughter. I looked at Clara, who was breathing in the particular way of someone doing the serious work of becoming. I put my free hand on the table, palm down, feeling the wood grain under my fingers. Solid. Real. Here. And I thought I carried all of it. Every hard thing. Every morning that asked too much. Every room that did not want me. Every silence that pressed down instead of simply being still. I carried it up a mountain in November with a canvas bag and a borrowed book of poetry, and a daughter I did not yet know how to love without fear. And it brought me here. And here it turned out was worth every step of the carrying.